Well, with that said, I'm going to unlock if I can figure it out. We're done here. So everyone who wants to come back on, turn on your camera or get on. Tim, I'm going to let you in here.
All right.
Awesome. There we go.
Hey, Tim.
First of all, hey, hello again, fellas.
Are we going to take a break?
Yeah, do you guys want to take a couple minute break for? I wouldn't mind myself since I've been.
How much of a break?
Let's see. What time is it right now? To me, it's 12:30 exactly. Want to just do 5 minutes?
Sounds good.
All right. So I'm just going to keep this on. If you guys want to stay on and chat or whatnot, I'm going to run to the loo. I'll be back.
Okay. No problem. No problem.
Yeah.
So, see, Dan, was it that hard to talk?
No, you got, well, like I said, you caught me totally flat-footed by coming in prepared for an Oxford debate.
Well, I knew I could let my old buddy of 30 years show me up. I was like stressing last night. Oh my God, I gotta read this article in that essay. I'm gonna take.
I printed out about 50 pages to read. Yeah. Hey, everybody else, you can unmute and chat. You know, it's Jen will reimpose order when she comes back. But
that's true. That's true. That's true. But I wish, Dan, I so wish that more people could just talk, you know what I mean? And not feel like they have to walk on eggshells. I really think one of the greatest harms with public discourse is that feeling, that sensation that you have to walk on eggshells with someone who's different, that you have to stay in your lane, quote unquote. You know, I love my judge. What are we doing? Are we wasting time? I don't care. I mean, I guess I try to live my life. Dan, you know this, as an individual. I always find that power comes from within. So when I see and read about slogans and doctrines, I just smile. I think, Dan, I think 3 things blessed me. All right, here are the 3 things. Number 1, I was born, and believe it, it's a blessing. I was born in the South in 1961. Why do I say that? Because I was born in a situation where Blackness was just the universe. It was just the ethos. So I didn't learn to think of Blackness as a plight or as a condition or as a problem to be reconciled. The biggest people in my life were Black. Dad, Mom, Grandma, Uncle James Scott, Uncle Will Ernest Sr., Uncle McCormick, Aunt Charlotte, Uncle William Womack. So all of my teachers were Black in the 1st and 2nd grade, all of my classmates. So I think because the first 7 years of my life were spent in a segregated school in the South, I acquired a normalized sense that, hey, Blackness is just the way the world is. Only in desegregation in the 3rd grade did I discover there are people who don't like Black people. I recall, I think I told you this before, Dan, I must have been called every name in the book in 3rd grade. I was the only Black kid in my class. And I was very hurt by that, very crestfallen. So I remember one day after racial abuse and harassment, I just sat down in the playground. I was 8 years old. And I just thought to myself, why are these people calling me names? Why are they assuming that there's anything important about Black skin or Blackness? And then I just concluded, well, you know, all the most important people in my life are Black, so they must not be very smart. I concluded basically that my classmates who were bigots and prejudiced were just not very smart. And I valued intelligence so much. So from that point on, anytime I encountered prejudice, I had a dismissive view because I assumed people who were prejudiced were just less intelligent. And that held me in great stead throughout junior high and high school. I really, really benefited from that. Number 2,
do you think that you were actually accurate in your assessment of their intelligence? Is it possible for somebody?
I think so. I mean, there were, you know what? Thinking about it, there was like maybe one student who was prejudiced, who may have been smarter than I was, but he was an anomaly. For the most part, the people who had those kind of attitudes were not. So I was just kind of dismissive. I just assume it is such a blessing to have grown up in the South in the 1960s, 70s, because you could see beyond prejudice and bigotry. You could recognize that, dad goes to a black bank, Consolidated Bank and Trust. Cousin Ralph Page, the lawyer, graduated from Howard Law School, right? All of your teachers were black at Hickory Hill Elementary School. The principal was black. So going into integrated schools was easier because I had a strong sense of self, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense, Wayne, because I kind of have a contrasting conversation about just experience and heritage, having grown up in the Bay Area,
Yes.
which I think perhaps the intellectual ideal capital of the world. I could say that with humility.
Go right ahead.
But it's funny, even in the Bay Area growing up, it was a segregated situation. Pan-Africanism, the Black Panthers having started there, et cetera. So I saw a lot of diversity, I saw a lot of exclusion, and I saw a lot of exclusion. But one of the terms, having grown up in Berkeley with a lot of diversity, that I've coined myself, and it's become more popular, is the notion of liberal racism. Liberal racist. What does that mean? The term obviously lays out the definition,
Sure.
but I discovered that even in my experiences as a youth, I would take a pre-calculus class to get in calculus. The Asian kids that would come from other countries would automatically be taken into the calculus class because the perception of me being black taking math and calculus was not in the construct of my teachers, but an Asian kid coming from another country was automatically put into the class. So the teachers embraced my intelligence, but they also were rooting for people they thought were underdogs and victims. So in a lot of this conversation about race, we talk about victimization, and I think that's a problem. When I was looking at applications for people who were going to business school when I was a director at IBM, many of the people felt that they weren't really compelling enough unless they talked about victimization, whether it was a female, a person from Jamaica, a person from East Oakland, whatever. And I realized that so much of this conversation is about victimization. Me, like yourself, I know my white relatives. I'm from a mixed culture of people. But that doesn't belie the fact that discrimination amongst my own family because of complexion, access, and entitlement, right? That was part of the success. So I began to realize that some people, instead of being good, they might be really lucky. They might be really, really lucky. And I met a lot of people who've gone to Ivy League colleges and they were routed to those universities. And I oftentimes think that they were more lucky, to be honest with you, than good.
Justin's had his hand up. So, Justin, you want to?
Sure, no problem.
Well, I'd actually like to hear the hosts respond to each one of us if they can. That'd be great.
Well, I think that Wink, you should have the get the first whack at this, since I think that he is suggesting, that your story may not be complete.
Well, good versus luck, right? I mean, there are clearly things. You know what? Life is about perspective. I always try to remember that there are over 7 billion people on the planet, right? So on the one hand, there's clearly luck, because I could have been born deprived in the Congo, Zaire, or I could have been born the victim of a landmine in the Balkans. I mean, I could have been born in many places. For whatever reason, the universe brought me into life in Richmond, Virginia, which had a unique history, right? So in a way, that was a blessing, because it's better to live in Virginia than perhaps war-stricken Zaire or the Balkans. On the other hand, it was bad luck, right? Because there's this informed history of segregation, right? And private personal prejudice among classmates. That's a bad thing. That's not lucky. But on the other hand, it's what you make of your situation in life that matters, not how you're born into it. In other words, you play the best hand that you're dealt. Now, you could argue, well, that is simply a matter of luck because that's your genetic propensity. Um, you know what? I think the true story is somewhere in between, as Jim might say. I think I'm probably an example of both the good and the lucky. And I think it's probably artificial to try to separate out the two. And that's probably true for most people, I think.
Sure.
I do say this. I will say this because, Dan and I are just great friends and we just talk. I do think, Dan, that I remember this is true story, Dan. When I was in college, first year, I was full of myself. I was accustomed to being at the top of the class. I was student council president in high school. I was the man. So at UVA, my first year, I went into school with a great confidence, self-assuredness. I felt that people who were prejudiced were just less intelligent. Well, at UVA, it's a very big school, and so there were probably people who were prejudiced who were smarter than me, which kind of unnerved me for a bit. But in any event, at UVA, I remember a classmate. He had gone to Stuyvesant in New York City, and he was Jewish, and he said we were both Equal scholars, same floor, and he said to me, "You smile all the time," and I don't know how to make of that because that's just the way I am. That's just my demeanor. But it stuck with me that maybe he was accustomed to certain people having a scowl or frown or being discontent all the time, which is just opposite of my personality. But that was kind of was that racial? I wonder. Did he from New York City, from Stuyvesant, find it strange that a black guy could just be happy, could just be optimistic, could just see the glasses half full, not half empty? And I wonder, that kind of ties into Tim's point. Maybe those perceptions and prejudices are out there, but the difference is, at least for me, I tend not to care about the prejudice of others. Vincent Cohen, partner at Hogan Hartson, said it well. He said, if it's prejudice is like the rain, you put up your umbrella and you keep walking. That's kind of how I view life. Yes, there's prejudice, but you put up your umbrella, you keep walking, you achieve what you got to achieve in life. Does that answer your question, Tim?
Yeah, well, I didn't have a question, by the way, but I accept your comment, right?
Okay.
I can simply tell you that again, growing up in the Bay Area wasn't a perfect experience. I grew up not far from Kamala Harris. My son ended up interning for her coincidentally, and my wife was bused to school with her.
Wow.
And what I've discovered, honestly, is oftentimes one's academic success has a lot to do with one being from a nurturing environment and having affirmative education access, not affirmative action, but affirmative education access. Because I grew up in a single family household with extended family, had to work my ass off to get access. When some of my friends who had dual parents and parents who were educated were already given a seat at the table. So when we say playing with a full deck and you play the cards you dealt, sometimes you're just not dealt any cards. And it's important for us to remember that not everyone gets to play in the game. And oftentimes our success assumes that because we're in the game, we're better or smarter. Some of the most intelligent people I ever met growing up in Oakland and Berkeley were the drug dealers. They were better at math. They had better people skills. They didn't have better morality, but they were amazing entrepreneurs. If you'd have given those people affirmative education and access to how to be institutional entrepreneurs, what type of institutions would we have? So one second. So in my basic essence of thing, I always remind my son that you have certain access and privilege, right? But you have cousins that you must reach back and assist that may not have that access and privilege, and it tortures him because their values are different. But again, sometimes we just don't get a deck of cards to play, and we have to create our own game.
If I can respond to that.
Can I respond to Tim briefly or not?
Yeah, go ahead, I'll follow.
Just briefly, Tim.
Briefly,
I love listening to Tim. Tim is so perceptive and relates good insights, and I appreciate that a lot. Two quick points, Tim. So point one, so my great-great-grandfather, Daniel Brown, was born a slave. He had 0 cards. 0 cards in a bad structure. How did he manage to acquire 500 acres of land by the 1880s?
Do you know if he actually, were you there to witness whether he had no cards or not? Because he may
Oh,
have had more, he may have had more chitlins. He may have had more chitlins than the other people. He may have had more bones than the other enslaved person near him. So, when we talk about excess and we talk about success, I think we need to redefine how we see success and excess, right? So the assumption that because one of our relatives, and I'm from ancestry that is successful as well through heritage, et cetera, but sometimes excess and luck and hard work are the combination of things, right? But we can't deny that we live in a society that has been choosing winners and losers, especially as relates to American descendants of slaves historically, and thus the term liberal racism I came up with. And then
oh yeah.
second, when we talk about heritage, I think you may have heard that my family is from Black Wall Street, Tulsa. And as you showed pictures of your relatives, these are pictures of my great great grandparents
Oh, I like him.
sitting in front of buildings that were burned out that we owned. This book, They Came Searching, right, was from my family's history of what happened to us during Black Wall Street or Greenwood, which we prefer to call it the natives and descendants. So my son's name is Ananias Emerson Mayo, which was the Emerson and Lewis family that I'm from. We had to start over and over again. We were the most successful, stridently beautiful people in the region, and we were burned out more than once. So when we talk about reparations, when we talk about descendants of enslavement, there's victimization to be handed out everywhere. But let's not forget the fact that many times some of us who are successful, it's because we may have had more privilege and access. And I also want to remind people that sometimes you could be fortunate, lucky, and not as good as we think we are, because the playing field is not always equal. And you take advantage of the opportunity.
I'd like to put a practical spin on this. It would make a huge, huge difference if, for instance, everywhere you looked in our educational system, that teachers and administrators and the families behind them and the political structure of the Board of Education, everybody from bottom to top, from student all the way to taxpayer, truly cared about the futures that those kids deserve to have.
Yes.
And if they cared, if the compassion were there, the policies would follow, the practices would follow, everything would follow. And we wouldn't be having this conversation. We wouldn't need the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because every day we'd be looking at the real world as it is, as it was, how we correct policies, how we correct practices, how we do things better so that kids have a chance to succeed.
Fact.
Here,
Well
here,
said.
here.
Justin, did you have a comment?
Yes. So thank you for hosting these discussions, because it does give us that perspective, that opportunity at empathy. I really appreciate your bringing that out of how much do we actually care about the success of our neighbors. And so there are two particular individuals that I'd like to raise as, because role models matter, right? And
Absolutely.
I think how we promote those role models definitely also makes a difference. But in particular, the two that I want to bring up, one is a current and one is a past, or personal relation, who had his success a generation ago. But so a current figure in the news right now is a guy named Killer Mike, and he's from Atlanta, and he is known for doing a lot of charity work, food banks, a lot of community outreach. He owns, I think, 3 barber shops now, and he talks a lot about a certain type of mindset. and I would call that mindset family or tribalism. And where his idea of starting a business is the cultural norm, a way of getting out of poverty. You start a
Yeah.
business. Well, you borrow money from family or friends because you don't necessarily trust the institutions around you not to foreclose on you if anything short term goes wrong. So you have to trust the people who you're close to. Then maybe they don't have a lot of resources themselves, or maybe they don't have a good way to vet your business. So it's still a struggle to actually get off the ground, even when you have help.
Yes.
And then so that's his base perspective. And the interesting thing to what Tim mentioned is that why is he called Killer Mike? Well, because he got his fame first as a rap artist,
Yes.
a hood, a thug, right? Because that is something that gets recognized as being a role model.
So-called thug.
Right. And yet his heart is community. His heart is build up your neighbor. He is love. And he, one of his the most interesting interviews I heard with him was with Bernie Sanders, right? A a white guy from Vermont and a black guy from Atlanta, two completely different circumstances, and yet same value system.
Absolutely.
That's
And
key.
so they were actually able to have a great discussion about ways that we can actually build up our country. And I think it's quite fascinating if you get a chance to listen to that interview. But so I put that as part one. Part two is a different mindset, but largely because of a different set of circumstances, I think. One of my former bosses, his family is from Jamaica, and he is very got a lot of the history of the Caribbean slavery system that was there. Very, very, and I say this not as a like a categorization, as a contrast, really. He's extremely dark skinned, and his family moved to Connecticut, and those folks are primarily very light skinned. Now, his father worked as a machinery expert, and so he had a pretty good career, and was able to provide for his family. And that could be just that thing by itself, right? But talking about skills. But he, as a cultural experience, had two facets that he talks about. One is the fact that he would go to school, and anytime there was a nighttime activity, they would joke about him and say, "Oh, we can't see you anymore," right? Because, oh, you're too dark and we glow. And so there was definitely, at least a difference consideration, if not a, um, value orientation with that. But what he said that he learned primarily from the folks around him is that they actually were quite smart. And if you had an idea and you shared it with them, the next day they would have had built something that was based on that. So he learned to become an entrepreneur and was actually a millionaire in his mid 20s by reverse engineering things electronically. And he had his designs bought out by relatively large companies. Well, he also blew all that money at a very young age too, because he didn't have the support system that taught him how to use it either. And so, um, in in his case, he operated, I think, a little bit more on an individualistic meritocracy sense rather than a family tribalistic sense. And I bring out both of those because it's different perspectives in life, but there's different consequences that come out of those. And so, which one is better? Well, I don't know if I necessarily want to make a judgment, but what I do want to say is that individualism, or sorry, collectivism, has its pitfalls in that you can often have problems with trust outside the tribe.
Yes.
right? Those institutions.
Yes.
Only now is Killer Mike actually advocating, hey, we need to get more banks for the unbanked. Partly, I think, because there's enough community sense where you can establish that trust where you couldn't before.
Mm-hmm.
I hope he's sincere and genuine about that, like he's not a grifter of any sort. And then on the individualistic sense,
He's been
but
vetted. He's been fully vetted.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think he's genuine. And then, but anyway, on the individualistic sense, there's a whole set of perspective that you lose if you think only internally from only your own perspective.
Yes.
And you can, you know, ride the wave and get a high, but you can also crash and burn. And
Mm-hmm.
so, bringing those two things in, okay, now what's the thing that's racking my brain about all this current circumstance? And like we can talk about history as being genetics, as being human race, as being ancestry and heritage, and that's great, I think, for empathy, so that we realize that, you know, we have to work together. But how we work together is a here and now thing, even. And so, one of the things that has concerned me is when this pandemic hit and the resources were allocated according to the subsidies. Well, a lot of communities of color were left out because of the structure of the banking system that we have, and also because of the structures of the laws, too. Right? One of the more interesting things was, one, you had to have an established relationship with a bank in order to get access to a lot of funds. Two, bigger banks like Chase Bank ended up tending to get a bit of favoritism in that. And three, there was actually a change to the law for the PPP system at the last minute, in which it went from 500 employees total for a business to 500 employees per location could qualify for these funds. And so all of a sudden you saw these, you know, billion-dollar companies, IPOs, people who had all sorts of access to money, just getting more money that they really could have gotten elsewhere, and people who had, as Tim says, no cards whatsoever, just basically literally thrown out on the street because their business was closed due to the laws.
Right.
So I think there's plenty of systemic problems, and I don't know that it necessarily falls directly on ethnicity all the time, but it certainly there is a disparity between ethnicities that we really need to address in our discussions of inequality.
But I think that can be done, as you would agree, without reparations for American slavery per se.
Yes, but right. So like, obviously, $40 quadrillion is not something we can just plunk down on the table.
Right.
On the other side of things, like you have to take the first step to get the next step, and eventually, once we realize the progress that we're making, we can strive for the ideal, right? Not that we have to literally take vengeance now or anything like that, but that we can actually start working towards healing the wound so that we do become whole.
But Justin,
You know,
how do you satisfy this problem? Suppose you do reparations in part, and then advocates say, hey, satisfy our demands today, and then we've got 12 more. The more demands you satisfy, the more demands we have for reparations. I mean, that's kind of the problem, isn't it? That
hey guys,
it
can I
becomes
offer
unending.
can I offer something, because I have to step away pretty soon. I have a hard
Sure,
stop pretty soon. But you know, it's
sure.
funny. Even when we talk about reparations and we talk about history, we have best practices with reparations that's already been done
Hmm.
for the Jewish community, for the Japanese intern community. So
Mhm.
why is it whenever it comes to Black people, history is a foreshadowed concept when these things have been done before? Reparations have been given. We know how they work. So why are we trying to figure out if it's possible to do and how to do it when we already have best practices?
Sure. I think because of causation, that would be my answer.
Well, no, I disagree. You know, Tim's question is why do we have such a problem, you know, dealing with slavery? Look, that's not because of causation. That's because of resistance. That's because of feelings of guilt. That's because of resistance to accepting that on the part of whites and possibly part of other people, including Asian immigrants and so on.
Yes,
that
absolutely.
that we collectively, we non-descendants of slaves, you know, have reaped a benefit, and there is a great deal of discomfort in, you know, engrossed in the concept of accepting that we've received a benefit that might conceivably be taken away. You know, so now if we approach this issue, you know, look, Wink, you and I have gone back and forth talking, you know, we've characterized our conversations as coming from a context, a framework of trust,
right,
a framework of understanding each other. You know, when you come from that position, you recognize the limitations of the other person. You know, so like you know, if white America were in the eyes of people who are pushing for reparations, were if those whites were genuinely perceived by the blacks as, you know, as genuinely concerned about restoring equality of opportunity, restoring the ability to go through life without prospering and then have it taken away because the laws or the mobs, you know, said you are too prosperous now, we're going to knock you down to your proper position again. You know, if they knew that the future was a future of uplift as you describe it, you know, then they would say, okay, it's like when you lay open the books, some businesses are transparent in their books so that the employees can see, you know, that they're being paid a fair wage, and that really they can't be paid more because this is what the books show. You know, so if black people in America who are feeling aggrieved could say, yeah, I know you're doing the best you can, you know, and, you know, look, I would not like it, you know, if my choice was to uplift a young black person at the direct cost of pushing down my daughter's opportunities. That wouldn't be fair. But, you know, if I can find a win-win solution within my means, and speaking more broadly, if we white Americans and other Americans from, you know, who are more prosperous, have more social capital, can create a way for people who have not had these opportunities to be uplifted without it being an excessive cost, because they know that they're no longer demanding that it be a win-lose proposition, but instead a win-win proposition, then we can all do it.
I applaud that. Win-win always is the best way to approach things. Definitely is.
Definitely. And that's why in the win-win concept, one of the affirmative action notions that I've discovered is really effective is affirmative education. Because me living in Central Valley, California, on the Clovis side of town, compared to the Fresno side of town, it's the same tax base. But why are the schools on the Clovis side of town so much more superior than the schools on the Fresno side of town? And we're in the same pretty much tax base. That's choosing winners and losers. So affirmative education instead of affirmative action would have probably addressed that appropriately. But I do think that a fat cat won't hunt. Why would a fat cat continue hunting? So the people who have licked their paws and who are entitled in the social system with social equity, why would they reach back and teach people to hunt? Fat cats don't hunt. So many times we lose the ear of the inner city and extended community of Black people, because us fat cats, we don't want anything taken from us. And it's part of that privilege and entitlement mentality that is inclusive of all races. When I'm around Asian Americans, they think they outwork everybody, right? Jamaican Americans, they have 9 jobs. You tell me that a Black kid is inside their mother with a computer and they get to determine whether they have blue eyes, whether they have access to Harvard. They don't get a choice. You're born in a circumstance you're in, but with affirmative opportunity, okay? Not entitlement, not labels, not victimization. We can even the playing field. But what I've discovered is that people really don't want that, because it may prove that some of us are not as smart and as capable as we think we are. And sports is a perfect
legacy
idea.
students at Harvard.
That's deep.
What's that?
You know, actually, this is what I was going to say when you were talking earlier, Tim. I'm reading right now a book by Wilfred Riley called Taboo.
Okay.
And he has a lot of good statistics. And I love your idea of affirmative education. I love that. I'm going to use that. We're going to talk more about that at some point.
Okay.
But, you know, one of the things that he was saying in this book, and he goes through, I mean, he's very detailed in his statistics, was looking at kids who are poor, single parent, etc. It is their outcomes are not based on race. So, I mean, you've got that. And I love that affirmative education, because to me, what you're talking about is like less about race and more about caste.
Absolutely.
That's something that Dan brought up. And so I think that we've got a caste problem as much or more so than we have a race problem. And I think the answer to it is affirmative education. I love what you're talking about, but I don't want to put it in the realm of race, because I think that there are so many places, poor whites, poor Hispanics, that are not getting the opportunities.
Absolutely.
It's true.
Yeah, I love that. We're gonna have to. I'm sorry. Justin has had his hand raised, and I jumped in. Sorry, Justin. Go ahead.
No, actually, it's a continuation of what you're talking about, and there's a specific solution that I'd like to propose in all of that. So I've got somebody from my hometown who actually started charter schools, and what's the benefit of that? So to speak to what Tim was saying, being in the same tax base but having different educational outcomes. Well, so he was able to bring parents more involved in their students' education by sending out educators directly to them to say, here's what the state requires for curriculum. Now, what would you like your student to learn? And you don't necessarily have to participate in the education, though we encourage it, but we want to make sure that our students are actually being served. So that's what we're going to start with, is the accountable party knowing what's going on and being able to make their own decisions with that. And that extended to all sorts of different systems, such that literally he was giving the same or better quality education to the students at half the price of a traditional brick and mortar location, to the point where the California Teachers Association said, that is so unfair, you're going to have to give up all that money so that you can put it back into these schools that are underperforming. And part of it, I would say in the end, is a failure of imagination, that we keep trying to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. But part of it really is the structures that we have in place when we talk about systemic racism or systemic this or the systemic that actually inhibit innovation. And so why did I bring up the whole thing about the PPP? Because jobs really are the innovation engine of any economy. And most skills are not learned necessarily even in school, they're learned in jobs. Plus, that's where you have income in order to be able to apply to other choices of things like education. So what I'd like to see a little bit more of is some equality in the banking system. And one of those things is an act in Congress going through right now called the Stable Act. If you guys want to read up on that, it gives a little more equal access to funds, financing for equal opportunity. But also, and I know this is a very controversial thing, more charter schools, pilot programs of different things with these kinds of accountability systems built in. and eventually vouchers. So it's not just the people who have the monies that can decide where to send their kids, but it's also parents that have a modicum of choice in deciding where to send their kids in order to get greater educational outcomes so that they can have a more successful future.
I want to remind everybody that that anybody can jump in here. We can talk. Wink and I and Jen. Because we're imposing on her. Can we can continue this conversation as long as it remains fun for everybody.
Hey guys, I have a hard stop. I think many may know. I think I mentioned to Dan, I'm a college referee, and we have some of our forums this weekend getting ready for the upcoming season.
Okay.
Well,
right
Tim,
on, Coach.
Yeah, Tim, we're gonna do this. This is the first of hopefully many. So please join us.
Also, yeah, thank you. It's been wonderful. Time well spent. So thank you so much.
Yeah,
and
thank you.
Thank you. The rest of the team, you guys are awesome. Thank you.
Thanks. Take care, Tim.
Okay, bye-bye.
Anybody else want to? Yeah, Dorothy? You'll have to unmute.
Oh, you're muted, Dorothy.
Am I unmuted?
Yeah.
Ah, there. We can hear you.
Okay. I really don't have any extensive comments. I wanted to say I have totally enjoyed Mr. Twyman's comment and
thank you.
arguments. I found those very entirely interesting. I've never really thought this through, so I don't have any great.
Is she on mute?
Nope. The cat just. Yep. You're on mute again, Dorothy.
I think the cat muted you.
My cat is such a muted me.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say thank you, Dan, for inviting me. I don't have any great input as I haven't really thought any of this through, but I've enjoyed arguments on both sides.
Thank you.
If I can add, that's one of the things that I sense happens a lot in my efforts to bring together sides of the Twyman family. And maybe it's just the way it is, but my sense is always that I've thought 10,000 times as much about these issues than my white Twyman cousins. So I sometimes feel like I'm very excited and I have lots to say, and my cousins are very respectful and appreciative, but it's just not part of their lived experience. So they recognize there's kinship and we're happy to know one another, but it's just interesting. It's a consequence of, I think, different social groups, right? So, for example, if I had my Black first Twyman cousins on, we would talk and there would be a certain level of depth to the conversation. But I think if I had some cousins on who are very distant, there wouldn't be the same. What I'm trying to say. Social groups, sadly, create different social experiences. And so it makes it easier for people to kind of not know one another as well and to fall into the respective echo chambers, if that makes sense. And so it is the courageous few, and I consider myself one of them, who really lives to know the larger universe. I enjoy learning about other people. One of my good friends said she considers herself to be an island person. So she always wants to go out to see the island in the bay. Now, there are people who don't. They prefer to stay on the shore, and that's fine. But she finds that her kinship is closest to those who also have a thirst, a desire to go to the island and to see something new and different. So I find in my lived experience, I love people like that. One of the things that attracted me to Jen, I think, is I think we enjoy seeking out others and overcoming divisions. But Dan, I want your thoughts on this. I think the history of social isolation and social segregation works against knowledge of other experiences. I mean, there's a whole world of, you know, Black sororities, Black fraternities, Black colleges, Black associations, you name it. One could choose to live their life very easily in an all Black setting. And that's fine. Some people do. I've chosen to live my life trying to know as many different people as possible. So I feel I'm enriched. I feel that I have a greater richness of my experiences and life experiences. But I think, Dan, how do you address the consequence that a history of social segregation has produced such different social experiences that it's easier for us to remain separate in our echo chambers than to reach across boundaries and grow to know one another? What's your thought on that? Because I know in the Jewish community, Dan happens to be Jewish. I know in the Jewish community there are Jewish associations, right? There are synagogues. There's the Tablet magazine, I think, and there are some institutions and associations just for the group. But I always sense, and I could be wrong, correct me, Dan, that in Jewish culture and consciousness, there's also a desire to reach out to the greater society as well.
There's Judaism is not homogeneous in this respect. You know, the traditional Jewish sects, the tradition, the Orthodox traditions and the hyper-Orthodox traditions tend to be very exclusive, very inward-looking. They maintain strict dietary rules and so on that make it very difficult for outsiders to sit down and break bread with them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think I have very little empirical evidence on this. I hope that somebody's done a study somewhere so that these groups can see some of the effects that I think are the result of this. But the you know, humans are territorial, they're tribal, and because that's a survival mechanism, you know, but you can take it too far. You know, a successful tribe is one that is internally coherent, you know, and pays attention to its own survival needs, but also interrelates with others so that it doesn't end up accidentally creating enemies, so that it's able to take advantage of opportunities, so it's able to cooperate across borders. You know, very Orthodox Jewish communities in various countries where they don't mix hardly at all with the outside culture often create a misunderstanding and enmity. And I think this is one of the sources. I don't want to blame them, you know, make them somehow the cause of their own victimization in the Holocaust, for instance, or in pogroms. But you know, if there is systematic misunderstanding by majority culture, and majority culture cannot penetrate, you know, there's no interpenetration, so that there's no way for knowledge, you know, that Jews really don't drink the blood of children, you know, then, you know, you create a situation, you know, so there is a balance to be struck, you know, between maintaining a tribalism that's healthy, that's supportive of the people on the inside, that has strong survival capabilities because of internal cooperation, you know, and competition with competitors with competitive tribes. But you can't take it too far, because then you end up becoming a bubble. You end up becoming an easy target for anybody who's bigger, who is jealous of your success.
Justin.
I see Anne has her hand raised. I don't want to jeopardize.
Okay, yeah, Anne.
Yeah, my name's Ann Wayman, and I'm as white as they come. But some people consider me an adventurer, which I didn't recognize at first. But when you guys finally wake up and make me queen of the world, one of the things that I want to do is make everybody travel, and there will be no staying at a Marriott hotel.
Well
Um,
said.
and I also want to acknowledge Wink, because it was his writings that got me to dig around in Ancestry.com and discover that I too am descendant from slave owners.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I also want to thank you both, because it hadn't occurred to me that the reason I'm in favor of reparations is to make me feel better.
Oh.
And I think that deserves some more thought than I've given it. I was really startled when I ran into that. But it's like somebody taught me to ask myself, what is it like to be white? And that question has been ringing in my life off and on for 20, 30 years now. And so I want to be part of, I hope I get to come to lots of these discussions. And so that's my piece so far.
Well, thank you, Anne. I appreciate that. I think these kind of conversations are invaluable, and I enjoy hearing your perspective. And I hope we have more of these as well. It's so funny because I now think of myself as a descendant of both slaves and slave owners, and I think for some Black Americans, they don't do that. They just automatically assume, well, I'm only on this side of the fence. When the truth is, you're on both sides of the fence. And that creates empathy. It forces you to see the other person's side of the picture. So I think that's an important point to note. Right. So what happens is Black descendants just kind of erase or cancel that side of their heritage. So when they learn about slavery, that's what they focus on, identify with. But our white cousins, they know who their ancestors were, and so they have to reach their peace with their slave-owning ancestors. They have to discern, do the hard work of discernment, separate the good from the deplorable, if that makes sense. One of my cousins said she views her ancestors as her children. And I kind of thought about that for a moment. And in a way, it kind of makes sense because there's that connection. It's not downstream, it's upstream, right? So, and as Dan knows, there's lots of strange people in our family trees, right? So,
and everyone.
Like if you look at me, would you think that I'm related to, I don't know, George Washington? No, but I am, I think. Would you think I'm a fourth cousin of Robert E. Lee? Nope, but I am. And so how do you kind of reconcile those historic characters in your family tree consistent with a sense of self as a Black American? I think it forces you to do hard work, to be honest. You have to discern more. You have to be more subtle and nuanced in your understanding of who you are and where you fit in the grander scheme of things, the American saga.
There's we've been having a discussion about the difference between being and doing on this issue, and the what you're describing, Wink, and what you described, Anne, is having slave owners in your past, in your ancestry. I probably do too. I mean, my father's well, I don't know. It's hard to say because there's different stories, and I've never looked into the genealogy. But supposedly, a long lost relative, died in the Alamo. There is a wolf on the list. Whether it's a wolf that's related to me, I really don't know. If it's might just be family legend. It also may be family legend, or it may be true that I'm, that John C. Calhoun, was a distant uncle. That may be family legend. I thought that was really cool when I was young. When I learned more about slavery and his role in it, the patina kind of came off. And but there's no point in denying what is, because what is. I mean, there's nothing we can do about it. The question is, what do we do next? And I'm can't be, a proper Christian or a proper Jew or a proper atheist or a proper this or that, in the perception of many people who consider themselves to be proper Christians, proper Jews, proper atheists, or whatever. But I can do things that are consistent with the ethical frameworks of each of those, bodies of thought. And so that's what I choose to do. I'm sorry I can't be like you, but I can do things that are consistent with our agreed, ethical standards and values.
And Justin has his hand up. I'm just going to say before Justin, you speak. One interesting thing about Wink, though, for everyone here who doesn't know him, is not only is he descended from white slave owners, he's also descended from black slave owners as well as black slaves. So there's a whole history.
That's actually
that's what?
Skylar.
Oh, that's your wife. Shh. Okay. Wink's family. Anyways, with that said, Justin, I'm sorry you have had your hand raised.
Sure, no problem. And the timing is good, right? Because we're talking about shared past. And so the interesting thing is I would say that I'm at a different branch from Wink in terms of what it would mean to be under a slavery system. But in a certain sense, I still was. And with Dan, it is a possibly different path for the Jewish heritage as well, but I think I may have that in me as well. I don't know all the way back to the land of Israel, but I have a somewhat of a hint. So now that I've teased a little bit, my cultural background is Polish Jew. And so now I have the whole Hitler connection and all of the Holocaust there. I have, before all that, all the empires that conquered over Poland. And they actually would farm out their peasants to whoever, between different kings of different countries. You'd work, say, 40 hours for your landlord that was in your area proper, and then you'd be sent out for another 40 hours to some landlord somewhere else to serve their nation because of the appeasement treaties and so on and so forth. And so the Polish language is really fascinating in that it seems to be like one of the few languages, if not the only language on planet Earth, that is designed so that the common people can't understand it. And they've literally changed all sorts of structure and words and everything based on the politics so that they could keep the power. And so it's a different form of slavery, but it's still a oppressive system. And then, to Dan's point about, say, like religious or other cultural heritage, again, I don't know all the way back to the land of Israel, but I do think that there's an aspect in here that matters beyond just cultural, and that is legal. As a lawyer, both Dan and Wink might understand this, that a lot of the American framework is based on Judeo-Christian law. And so the English system first, but going all the way back to Mosaic law. And one of the interesting features I find out of that tradition is the idea of welcoming a stranger into your house, because you never know when you're going to be entertaining somebody of great power. And so the sojourner was always given a certain amount of favoritism, even in the tax structure that they had, that 10% tithe. A portion of it didn't just go to grandma or the kid who'd lost his parents. It actually went to foreigners who were traveling through the land as well. And it was I think in a lot of ways, a form of cultural exchange. There was even a portion of the temple that was set aside for foreigners to come visit and learn of the culture and to have cultural exchange. Then what else is worth saying in all of that? In terms of slavery and structural advantage, it was a real interesting feature that the people who taught at the temple were not actually allowed to have their own means of provision on their own. Like land agriculture was how you got sustenance. Well, the priests could not own any. And that put them in equality with a lot of the people who were on the fringes of society because they were dependent as well. So there's all sorts of things, that different kinds of traditions that we can draw from different branches of things. But really, we can start by saying, oh yes, there's a lot more commonality than there is necessarily separation.
And I would be remiss if I didn't note my path that connects me to Justin. Justin mentioned that a part of his story, his heritage, includes Jews from Poland. My mother, her maternal haplogroup is L2A1. Justin may or may not recognize that, but that maternal haplogroup can be traced back 2,000 years to a Jewish mom. And so I have distant Jewish relatives in Eastern Europe. So we're all connected at some level through my maternal line.
And that's what I love. That's what I love about working with Wink, is just that idea. First of all, he's just a genetically optimist. As I'm sure you guys have all noted in our conversation today. But I love that he opened my eyes to this ancestry, and I do feel like that is. We're getting off the topic of reparations, but I feel like that knowing that connection and actually being able to see it and trace it makes a difference.
Yeah.
It's very different for us, at least.
Yeah, well, it's before Justin would have made that statement, and I would have felt no hint of a connection. But now, when someone says, "Well, I'm from Poland and my ancestor is Jewish," I think, mom's mom, however many generations ago, probably came from the same tribe.
I remember a video I saw not a year or two ago. The videographers brought together a bunch of people, and I think this took place in London. And they brought English and Pakistani and Arabs and all sorts of kind of people. They questioned them in advance. They interviewed them separately, and about their attitudes about the other, and there was a lot of prejudice. And then they did the 23andMe thing or something similar, and then they pulled people together and said, "Did you know that you're related, to this Arab person?" And it was a shock. And what was interesting was, now there's probably a lot of good editing involved in this, but what was interesting was that some of the most prejudiced people, the ones who expressed the prejudice, were pleasantly surprised to find, that they shared genetic heritage with these groups that they were prejudiced about. When before the end of apartheid in South Africa, genealogical, genetic research showed that all white South Africans, had Black African blood, including de Klerk, the final prime minister of white South Africa. It suddenly makes you realize that, that we are one vast pool, one vast genetic pool with more similarities than differences. There's a little bit of melanin difference. There's a difference in our cultural heritage, but we can learn from that. We can gain from our differences and as well as our commonalities. And there's so much to be gained, from finding our connections and our common strengths.
Yeah, here.
A particular introduction I want to make in maybe opening the door, breaking the ice on a lot of that, is to learn the games of a culture. Right? I know that there's so I'll ask, and maybe this isn't part of your heritage, Wink, but do you know the game Mancala, where it has the different
my wife loves to play that game. She loves it.
Yeah,
I don't know it, but she loves it.
Yeah, so there's one way to learn the values of a culture just by that. And then from the Polish side of things, a very famous game is called Pinnacle, and that one's a card game, but it actually covers a lot of the political history in a sense as well, and the strategies with the different system. And so how you can learn a lot about people by the games they play.
Interesting.
Ooh, I
And have
love
fun.
that.
And
I
in
would
fact,
say too, Justin, is that also by the not just the nonfiction, but by the fiction that every culture writes and reads. And you know, there's so much truth in how they think about the world in their nonfiction. I'm sorry, fiction, you know, in addition to the nonfiction. I love that game saying, Wink, we're going to have to talk about that later.
Yes, yes, definitely.
Now, how do we do it over the internet is the other question.
Yeah.
There's got to be an app for that.
I'm already, my brain is already spinning, Justin. Maybe we'll have to work together to create an app for that.
Sure. Hit me up.
Yeah, for sure.
Then connect you with my email and phone number.
May I ask if anybody else, Marjorie, Zena, and Victoria have not said anything, and I just wonder if you want to pipe up, you know, in our last few minutes.
I just haven't spent enough time thinking to be articulate and to have well-framed thoughts. So I have so enjoyed listening to this. So thank you very much. It's having a conceptual approach that takes in so many different points of view is very, very helpful. But I myself have really nothing to contribute here, I think. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Marjorie.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Marjorie.
Are you there, Zena? I don't want to put you on the spot.
I am. I'm sorry, baking. So I wasn't able to unmute as much as I thought that was a very interesting. I'm sorry?
Zena, I said Zena's a master baker. What are you making?
Not really master by any means. Banana, lavender, I don't know.
That's nice.
A bunch of weird stuff. It was.
I showed your label. Now she made a label for one of her sourdough breads. I think it's potato leek or some sourdough or something. And she put a shout out on the label to me. I showed it to Victoria. I don't know if Victoria, if you're there, this is the person.
Well, I mean, it was like working towards the election and you were busy. I thought it was a very interesting conversation. It did bring up different perspectives than I have ever imagined. I'm not from the US, so I cannot possibly, speak even thoughtfully about that. I did find myself working for a racism and health professors world renowned, and that was a very interesting experience because it wasn't an issue that where I'm from was any problem, but I think that you made I don't know how to pronounce your name, Twyman?
Twyman, yes.
Yes. You made a great point in separating this idea. Sorry, this is going to bring me a couple of times.
Oh, no problem. No stress.
Separating that you're talking about reparations with regards to slavery in particular. And right. First of all, I don't know that or a lot of other people have ever separated things. We kind of look at racism and then it's a combination of slavery and Crow and a whole lot of things. And it's
intellectually lazy not to separate it out.
Yes. So I was very curious about that. I think that the good points about the differentiation that I appreciate with what you guys were saying in terms of social identity. How much do we keep what we have and what our culture and heritage is versus, and would that necessarily entail closing people off, like other people who are not like us off? And I think every culture and every group of people are guilty to some extent of that. The thoughts I had as you guys were talking are, again, very simplistic and ignorant in a sense. Of when you were talking, I'm thinking in epidemiology, we're thinking of external validity, like what you observed or what you lived through. Is it generalizable? is it something that if we asked not everyone, but a representative sample of Black people, they would feel the same. They would have the same experiences. If someone was a victim, if I witnessed my sister getting murdered, and whoever killed her or responsible for that will not be able to, of course she's dead, but I have suffered as a result as well. And so it's not in my mind, it's not just the victim or the person who were harmed, but the ramifications of that on other people. And at the same time, if I was there by her bedside, for example, as she was dying, whereas my father wasn't, he did not suffer as much as I did. And to the point that a lot of you made, I think in terms of access and privilege as well, is that mental health is a huge component. So we might be given a whole lot of cards, even those who went to Harvard, but then you suffer from some sort of impediment. We know we can, we're prone to react differently to trauma, for example. Some people develop PTSD, some people don't, even though they went through the same thing.
Post-traumatic growth syndrome.
Right. And so if someone has that, I don't know that we factor that in with the cards. It's not necessarily just about what opportunities that person would, but also what they're dealing with. My professor's perspective had always been kind of like measuring to an extent. How does stress, how does racism truly impact people who live through it? And sometimes it is perceived, sometimes someone might be mean to you or me. Like I had that experience where I'm like, oh, is he because I'm not white or I'm not American? Like maybe that's why. And I think that's sometimes it's perceived, not really real, but it does have a huge impact on health. But how do you separate that? And so I think that there's so many. You've like all elicited a whole lot of thoughts for me that I've never certainly went there and would probably like talk a little bit more, although I'm unprepared to talk about that. But I thought it was incredibly insightful and helpful, and I appreciate you willing to have that conversation and enlighten us. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I really do. And you'll notice my very first line, my very first question to Dan was, "What year is it, Dan?" Right? And he tried to finagle around that. But it's 2021. We were not slaves. My dad was not a slave. His father was. You really have to go back almost 2 centuries, if not 3 centuries, to talk about the injury or the harm as I see it. And so sometimes I feel people don't do the hard work of intellectual discernment on causation. Because I think maybe the point isn't intellectual precision, but maybe ideological dominance, right? I mean, it's easier to argue once racism soiled the land, it has never gone away and the stain must be eradicated. There are people who believe we shall not rest until racism is eradicated from every blade of grass, every molecule. Now, and there are people who probably believe that. That's a horrible way to live one's life, right? I mean, it's 2021, don't want to beat a dead horse.
Actually,
your life will have more joy. Your life will have more joy if you seek purpose and meaning, if you take responsibility, if you presume an internal locus of control as opposed to an external locus of control. Dan, I didn't mention this before. I think 35% of Black Americans oppose racial reparations. What are we talking about? I just so much think it's a tiny slither of people, a tiny slice of people who are beating the drums in this direction. And I think most Black American, well, at least 30% actively oppose reparations. So I just wonder what it's really all about ultimately. What's it about, Alfie?
in political, talking about elections and electoral systems in political science, we not only talk about one person, but one vote, but also about intensity. And the intensity is a very important component. If somebody generally believes X, Y, or Z, but doesn't feel any particular intensity around it, then they're not going to take action around it. And it's probably because it's not an important issue, even if they intellectually agree with it. But if there's a substantial number of people who feel intensely about something, then should they be should they be dismissed, wherever they're coming from? I mean, look, approximately 15% of the colonial American population engaged in the fight against the British. That's a pretty small minority. Now, they were probably supported by a plurality of the rest of the population, but not with the sufficient intensity to actually engage in revolutionary activities. So whether the person who is feeling intense about an issue is agreeable to oneself or not, I think it's important to consider, to take their views, their reasons for their views into account. I mean, like, I don't like what happened at the Capitol, but I think it's perfectly legitimate and, in fact, necessary, to understand where they're coming from, not why they did what they did in terms of like proximate cause, who incited them, what their particular ideas are about the Boogaloo or the apocalypse or whatever, even white supremacy. But what is deep down coming from, what is deep down motivating their intensity, not just their intellectual agreement with their motives and goals, but what is generating the intensity? What is it in their past? What is it in their present? That makes them believe that there is meaning in storming the Capitol rather than meaning in uplifting, or demanding the resources to uplift their own communities.
And that translates quite well to my opposition to reparations and that of 35% of Black Americans. What is it that compels my intensity? I could be watching Star Trek. I love Star Trek, as Jen knows. I love The Twilight Zone.
So do I.
What motivates me on a Saturday morning to express my opposition with my dear friend Dan? I think it's because, and I told Jen this once, I think people who really, 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 with intensity, support reparations can only see descendants of American slavery as poor and vulnerable and in need. I think people who intensely oppose reparations, like me, see descendants of slaves as proud, resilient, self-reliant. You may even have a few free Black slave owners in the family. I mean, there's a history of property acquisition and educational achievement. So we recoil because the premise of reparations seems based in charity or pity, to kind of use those words. It's not something that a proud, resilient, enterprising people would accept without a whimper.
Well, and in fact, many people who have, dragged themselves back from the abyss, or raised themselves up, from the gutter or whatever, however they might conceive of it, they've overcome hardship. They can feel legitimately insulted, by what it can implicitly mean. I mean, this is one of the reasons why some people attacked affirmative action, because the white students and faculty, in some colleges would say, oh, they're only there because of affirmative action, when in fact they really busted their butt and they're really smart.
Sure.
So in a sense, having the help in the atmosphere, of achievement, undermines, their own and others' belief in their ability to have achieved what they achieved.
Well, and it's not just the individual today. It's almost as if it's a slap against the great grandfather or the great great grandfather. And I think that, remember when I said one of my cousins views her ancestors as her children? I mean, in a way, I think of these people as our children. You know, Congressman Rainey, Edward Rainey, James Mitchell, Richard Holloway Sr., Richard Holloway Jr., George Shrewsbury. I could go on, Dad, as you know, of enterprising Black people who achieved during slavery. We're not talking 2021. We're talking the 1850s, the 1870s, the 17th. Schuyler, my lovely wife, Schuyler's, I think, is 5 or 7 great grandparent, founded the very first association in North America for free blacks. He created a tradition. That association lasted for 150 years. He trained his son-in-law to become a carpenter, and then he eventually became one of the wealthiest blacks in Charleston, South Carolina. In the 1840s, he had 15 properties. His portrait is the very oldest portrait of a Black American in Charleston, South Carolina. It's in my office, on my office wall. His son became the very first Black to be a juror in South Carolina during Reconstruction. His son-in-law became one of the wealthiest Blacks in Charleston, South Carolina, and his estate was so large that after they closed probate, when he died, it kept growing and growing and growing. He owned 10 slaves, one of the 4 largest free Black slave owners in Charleston. So when you have people like that in your family achieving in the 1790s, the 1840s, the 1870s, to say we need reparations in 2021 to help us deal with the effects of slavery, yeah, it's losing.
Well, you're lumping things back together.
I think Justin is. Let's see. Speak up, Justin.
I want to resonate with actually what you're saying, Wink, in a bit. I want to acknowledge and appreciate the fact that you have that backstop, that story to say, look, transformation can happen, and there's a lot to unpack in that. And one of the things that I want to say about all that is to the point made earlier from Tim about framework, about launching pad, about like a community of support. And you mentioned this association that helped get the education, that helped create the economic independence. And that is, I think, is probably one of those core principles that we probably all need to be able to focus on. Is at what point do we're talking about that, family, children, heritage thing, be able to leave the nest, if you will, become independent enough that we become a force of our own and a force for good. And so one of the other folk heroes I'd like to invoke here is a guy named Alexander Hamilton. And the reason I do that is because that has a lot of different opinions from different people over the course of history based on how they were taught about him. And if we allow ourselves not to say, well, oh, the past is just a bunch of bad stuff and be intellectually lazy about it, but say, okay, well, what really went on? Then we can actually see that even though this guy was from a white heritage, he had some touch points that would be helpful to all people, in that his policies that he designed were actually supposed to be economic access equality. And but what I first want to start with before we get there is his own level of difficulty in getting out of where his troubled situation. Born into essentially from a near prostitute mother whose father abandoned him. She died of a deadly disease, and he almost did too. his cousin stole all the family inheritance, which wasn't very much, and then he either left or died as well. So literally, here's somebody practically living out of a gutter, and yet how did he become the financial engineer of the entire United States of America from this isolated island?
Fortitude.
Well, sorry, go ahead, Wink.
Fortitude.
Yes, fortitude is probably the first ingredient, that internal factor, as Zena mentioned.
Self-confidence.
And another one would be the environment that he actually attached himself to, right? He went from being a bookkeeper for his landlord, because that's who he knew, right? That's all my community. And his fortitude made him so good at that his landlord put him in charge of the entire business at 14 years old. And he went away for like 2 years while this guy was debating with the finest merchants in the world at the time, in some cases, about what's a fair pricing on things.
Right.
And then even with that, though, he got set back again. A huge hurricane came and destroyed most of the island.
Right.
And he didn't allow that to stop him. He wrote some essays that got the attention of a wealthy patron in the area, and he said, this kind of, what it was NAACP say, a mind is a terrible thing to waste. Let's send this guy to college. So they did. And then he ends up in the Revolutionary War, and he's writing correspondence for General Washington. And then the war is over, and General Washington says, "You're such a great guy, I'm going to put you in my cabinet here for the Treasury." And then he manages to create a society for manufacturers, which I think may end up relating to, in some way, Wink's progenitor here.
Mm-hmm.
That the manufacturers, the carpentry, the skill set that enables us to have the tools to not only thrive, but to be generous.
Wink,
So I think we need to work on creating more of that.
Yes, Jen?
I was going to say, before you respond, Anne has had her hand up, and I apologize, Anne.
That's okay. My recognition that part of my being in favor of reparations is just to make me feel better. But part of it is also, as I began to just examine my own white privilege, which was a brand new thought to me when it was first presented. I grew up upper middle class. It's better to be red than dead, or dead than red. That kind of conservatism, and so things have changed. And I have a genuine, there's I think a genuine, not totally self-serving feeling that I want to help, or I want to acknowledge the past. And I have no idea, now that you've talked me out of reparations, maybe. I'm not sure that you have, but that I'm considering it. What's a better avenue for me?
Star Trek.
I watch Star Trek. I love Star Trek. I seem to be in good company here. But that and maybe I don't. Maybe the answer is to just continue to live with the tension of it.
Now that's a good. She raises a good point, because, and Dan has as well. There is tension. There is a sense of grievance. There is discontent in the land, and that's true. I think we need to address that, but I think we need to address it in ways that don't bring the horrors of the defeating past into the present, such as American slavery. There are other things. Now, notice we didn't talk about, the debate was not about Jim Crow or redlining or public school slavery. Those are different issues. Maybe not. There could be things we might label reparations to address those specific past ills. But those are separate and distinct from American slavery, which creates a causation problem in my view. But I do think we need to do something to address that sense of discontent. I think Dan is quite right. Ann is quite right. I just think that there's a job, but reparations for American slavery is the wrong tool. Is the wrong
Okay.
tool. That's what I think.
You know,
Thanks.
uh, you know, you go back to this proximate cause thing, and
Yes.
you know, and you know, and you've just distinguished redlining and so on as different from slavery.
Right.
It's obviously not the same as slavery,
Right.
but you know, when you have a government policy, a law, Title III, you know, or you know, all these different things, you know, and bank regulations and real estate rules and so on and so forth, that essentially prohibit mortgage loans, you know, in neighborhoods with one black person. You know, you know, you are setting things up, you know, for a future slum. You know, you are setting things up for a smaller tax base. You are setting things up, you know, for reduced school funding. You know, back when they were strictly property tax based. You know, and so on. And then of course, then you're setting things up, you know, for the next generation, you know, to be worse off, you know, and the families to break up, and so on and so forth. So it's an endless chain. Now, some people escape from it, and some people don't. You know, one of the people that I've mentioned to you, you know, when I in 1976 after the Democratic Convention, which I attended, I was on a bus from Raleigh, North Carolina, back to Oregon, and I sat next to an elderly black gentleman who was on his way to Oklahoma City, and his story was powerful. It stuck with me all my life. You know, it's somebody in his past, you know, after slavery, had set up, you know, whatever the equivalent then was of a family foundation, a family trust, and his family, his extended family, was getting together for their annual or biannual um, uh, reunion in Oklahoma City. They had rented 2 entire hotels, and they had work on the agenda. You know, in addition to family activities, they were interviewing the kids for scholarships, you know, for business loans, for all sorts of things. The entire family was an economic unit.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and they regularized all these processes, and they were a democracy, a small d democracy in the doing of it, you know, with elders' guidance, because he was the patriarch of the family, you know. And I thought, wow, this is fantastic. So I mean, there is no reason, you know. He would probably say, we don't need reparations, we're doing it our own. But, and here let me throw in the but, there is no excuse, even if one doesn't, if even if a family unit or any other community doesn't need reparations, there is no excuse for predatory activities that result in the taking away of that hard-earned wealth. You know, there's no excuse, you know, for allowing a local white power structure to knock somebody back. You know, maybe you don't help them forward, but you damn well, there's no ethical, legal, or moral justification for allowing crimes to occur that can deprive people of that.
Here, here. I mean, Dan and I, we're on the same page, I think. Same page. I think the only thing that separates us is that my anal, compulsive clinging to the doctrine of causation. I wanted to mention something because this redlining issue is in the literature. Ta-Nehisi Coates talked about in his Atlantic article about reparations. It's often referred to redlining, how it, you know, prevented the development of Black American wealth. Is that correct? Redlining, more or less, is one of the culprits.
Right.
I think back to my own lived experience, and as we know, my expertise can come from my lived life experience. When I grew up, when I was like maybe 9 years old, we moved out into the county, a suburb, Chesterfield County, Virginia. And it's a conservative Republican suburb, traditional. and we lived on a street, Jean Drive. Now, Jean Drive was 100% black. Everyone was black on Jean Drive. And it was just like middle America. I've told Jen this in the past. Crime, I remember the first time I saw a police car. I must have been like maybe in high school, 11th grade, and there was a car going down our street, and we all looked at it like it was an elephant walking down the road. I mean, the whole idea of police and law enforcement was so alien to our existence in our world. But more importantly, the point of poverty. Remember, Jen had said, well, some people think that they're holdovers from slavery, crime, and poverty. Let's talk about poverty. So I lived on Jean Drive, and across the street lived Mr. Friend, James B. Friend Sr., and we respected him. He lived in a modest home. There's something fancy about his home, but what was really important about Mr. Friend was his enterprise. Mr. Friend, who must have been maybe in his 60s when I was 9 years old, right? So he lived through 30s, 40s, 50s. He lived through Jim Crow, all that stuff, redlining you talk about. Mr. Friend built every home on Jean Drive that I lived on. He built every home on the other street, the corner street, and homes across Jefferson Davis Highway. I know that's not PC, but across Jefferson Davis Highway. He must have built and developed 45 homes. He was a very wealthy man, but he lived below his means in a very modest home. And so, when I think about redlining, I think about Mr. Friend, my neighbor across the street. I saw no evidence that redlining, quote unquote, had any impact on his wealth accumulation in the 1960s. He was a wealthy man. His children and grandchildren are wealthy people, wealthier than I am. I've never heard Mr. Friend talk about redlining when I was a little kid on Jean Drive. What's your rebuttal to that, Dan?
Redlining was an insurance, whether both FHA and bank, and Coates covers this, in that Atlantic article. Redlining was not just the lining out, of neighborhoods with blacks and other undesirables in them, but also the lining in, from a grade from A to D of the neighborhood, supposedly low risk to supposedly high risk.
Sure.
And I don't know if it was mandatory. I would think that from a risk management perspective on the part of the banks and the FHA, it was just a matter of designating, territorial areas that were relevant to their lending structure. So if you're living in an area that is fairly prosperous, and now by the 1960s, those laws are being outlawed. They're being repealed. They're being found unconstitutional, and so on. But if you had a prosperous black middle class already, then why would the bank, be ignoring that market? They may not be engaging in the redlining in that specific area. Now they may have a branch that over in this other urban area that they don't understand where they are doing redlining. So the fact that and of course redlining, you only need a mortgage if you don't have the money to build the house yourself or to buy the house yourself.
Oh, man, that's a good point, because there was a long tradition in my family and in that area of people just building their own homes. My uncle Robert Daniel did it. My uncle Will Ernest did it. My great-great-grandfather did it. My uncle Scott did it. So there was a tradition, and I'll grant you the point, of people being self-reliant, of building homes with their own hands.
And now I can tell you as an ex-architectural designer, that you cannot do that in most places anymore.
Uh-huh.
Because you could build, in a rural area, even now it's gotten to the point where, say, in the county of San Diego, you've got to get a building permit, for even a shack.
Right.
But back in the day, you could build a small house, so you could, if you could buy the property and it wasn't too expensive, and you could put together the materials and save them over a year or two, and then you could build yourself a small house, and then you add on to it as time goes along.
And so I think that's
not do that anymore.
But I think that's why, this is a good point, Dan. So I think that's why when I look at this issue of redlining through my lived experience, my lived life experience during the 60s in Chesterfield County, it doesn't resonate so harshly because I saw people around me being self-reliant and making their own homes.
Right. So the the need is for you, to go beyond your lived experience, and to try better to relate, while here I am imposing my morality on you, to relate to the lived experience of others, to include
but I
them
thought
in the universe.
expertise
Talk
comes from
about
your
busting out of the bubble.
But I thought expertise comes from your live life experience. Coach tells me so.
No, here's the thing. Here's the thing, Wink. Your lived life experience is where it starts, and that's what generates your intensity.
Right.
If the lived life experience of the people who attacked the Capitol, generates their view of the world. Okay, but neither you nor they nor any of the rest of us, has a thorough understanding of everyone else. Maybe a few people here and there.
Yeah, I agree.
It would do you good, and rebut this if you like, but it would do you good, to put yourself in the shoes, of some of these other people, just for the purpose of trying to get where they're coming from.
Sure. Yeah, and and I never question the legitimacy of someone's other perspective. I mean, I accept that. I mean, but I do find it fun to play around with these slogans, because there are lots of slogans out there, Dan, as you know, and one of the slogans is, well, I don't need a fancy degree to say this because my lived experience is so I was playing with you a little bit there. But just keep in mind, so much in the public discourse, Dan, I find, comes from a position of a different kind of experience, which is legitimate, grant you that. But it's why I sometimes feel a little disaffected from conventional Black culture and consciousness, because I never see myself. And because I don't see myself, I just sort of, it's kind of leaves me tired. I have a feeling of wearisome, being weary, because I know that there are other authentic stories out, and they're authentic because I lived it. It may not be the predominant story, but I feel in some ways the public square has to acknowledge the full panoply of lived experiences. That's what I wish for, Dan.
Yeah.
I wish for a school. I wish for a high school where people learn about slaves, and they learn about free Black people during a time of slavery. I wish for a day, Dan, when kids in college, they learn about the oppressed people who are deprived in inner cities, and they learn about multi-generational socialites, our kind of people who have second-generation homes in Sag Harbor or Martha's Vineyard. In law school, Dan, I pray for a day when we not only worship the likes of Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw, but we also recognize the important contributions of the first Black lawyers during slavery, like Megan Boland Allen and Robert Elliott and John Mercer Langston and John Boyer for Sean and Sean Sweatrock, and I could go on, as you know I could, Dan, because I know
you are really insulting my ignorance.
Hey, let's let Justin has a question, and then let's wrap up because we've got so many more things to talk about.
So the interesting thing that we seem to be on the contour or the edge of, that I'd like to get in the center of, is in that sense of lived experience, because in order to improve, you have to get that perspective. In order to get that perspective, you have to have that exposure. So dialogue is one of those places where it starts, and a lot of people just have never considered certain things before. Not that they couldn't be capable of, but that there's no pathway to that greater understanding of other people, much less what works on a global scale. And so what I was thinking in terms of like a rubber meet hits the road sort of thing in all of this is what is a commonality of shared pain going on right now? And COVID should be something that is bringing us all together because, well, we're all at risk, at least of the um, whether we're asymptomatic or not, we're at least have the risk of inconvenience. Like, okay, I have to watch out for, make sure I don't infect grandpa, which means I, may not be able to do the same normal tasks that I did. Maybe I'm not going to be flying. Maybe I'm not going to be doing other sorts of things. But what's like a number one common thing that I keep hearing over and over again? It's that I am not able to work right now. And whether it is from the perspective of I lost my job because I'm in a service industry that is no longer open at all, and so there, I don't have a job, or maybe I was the business owner of that entity and I can't continue on my economic dreams because of that same exact situation. The funny thing is, they could be part of the same company and still not talking to each other. Literally in a weekly group I had that I just had to walk away from, there was a business owner and an employee of that business in the same company, in the same room, and they could not talk to each other about their own experiences on what they were going through. And of course, this really matters because the gap is so huge. One of the employee was literally always just short of the money he needed to survive. His car was breaking down. First off, he made minimum wage. He literally cleaned up after diapers thrown on the sidewalk and unruly customers. And he was making so little that when his car kept breaking down on the way to work, he was afraid he wouldn't be able to keep working and then be thrown out on the street. The boss, on the other hand, was somebody who drives around in golf carts all day and talks philosophy or talks whatever esoteric thing that he has on his mind that day in general. And neither one of them were having conversations with each other to help understand this could actually affect the bottom line of the business even.
Yeah.
Well, we've heard the stories about how Walmart and other big corporations who pay their employees so little that they have to go on food stamps to survive. Essentially, the taxpayer, is making a direct contribution to their bottom line because the taxpayers are subsidizing those employees because they're not paid a decent wage. There's that, in my opinion, that shouldn't be allowed to happen. We ought to adjust the structure, adjust the laws to prevent that sort of thing from happening because we're committing a hidden subsidy. And we're in our system
corporate welfare, yeah,
full of subsidies, and we shouldn't be subsidizing the well-off. We should be subsidizing, those who are still struggling to get well off. But that's the system we have, and that, of course, goes to the role of money in politics and power in politics and so on and so forth. I remember a study that I read about. I read a review of it in India when I was there in the 1980s. That when they ask people of different castes, and castes correlate fairly closely with class in India, not entirely, but pretty high correlation. They asked castes, low caste, high, upper, what they knew about the people's lives in the caste below them and above them, and the upper castes thought they knew a lot about the lower castes. And when you compare the actual facts, they didn't know diddly shit. But the lower castes knew a lot of very accurate information, about the immediate castes above them, one or two castes above them, because their survival depended on it. They didn't know very much about the castes below them, because their survival didn't. But those castes knew about them. So there was this, but they thought they did. Everybody thought they knew something about the castes below. Now, so if you talk to my grandmother in Wichita, Kansas, who had a less oblige kind of patrona sort of an attitude towards her black employees and black housekeepers, she would probably say, "I know all about them," because I was with her once when she just walked into one of her employees' house who was sick. She didn't even knock; she just walked right in. She owned the place. She took care of the medical bills. She took her food when she was sick, and so on. So that's good, right? But she presumed that she knew something about the family that I'm sure she didn't know. That she knew some external details that were more than a lot of employers would know, but not really enough to like get into that emotional space so that she treated her like an equal. And most employers, and most people with servants think they know a lot more than they really do, but they don't ask, they don't know, they really don't know.
Jen, you wanted to say something? Did we lose our host?
No, you didn't. I just put myself on mute as my dog is begging me for food. No, I just think that there's so much more to discuss.
Cutie. Can we see your doggy?
Can you see him?
Oh, cute.
He's a pug.
Hi.
There we go. Very cute.
Yeah, there's just so much more to discuss, so I'm excited. I think, it's probably for all of us time to find a place to wrap up.
Yeah.
But I think that we should do this. I mean, it looks like this is something that we should continue to do with different topics and different conversations. Do you all agree? Yeah.
Well, with it, I'm happy to waste everybody else's time.
Yes.
Well, I think, there's so many things that came out in the discussion, like redlining and Jim Crow, that really weren't, that played into reparations, but I think there's so many things we can parse out to do again, where we can get into some, actually more meaty conversations.
This isn't meaty enough for you. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I mean, it's oh my gosh, are you kidding me? It's so meaty. That's why I'm kind of like, maybe we should like
do a lot of editing and cutting.
Maybe we should boil it down to And I love the idea, and Justin is talking too here on chat for you guys to see the caste system is something, Dan, that you brought up, and then we brought up when Tim was here, and Justin's bringing up too. And I think that that's a really important discussion as well, is like caste versus race, and socioeconomics versus race as well, or where the intersection of those. So we'll definitely plan some other conversations.
Well, and my major point in bringing up the within the business thing is that we have touch points that we could use as launching platforms for mutual benefit, for common growth, that I think are kind of being, as they say, money's being left on the table, if you will. And we're raining it down from the federal government, but we're not building it up from the individual businesses that are the prosperity engine in America. And when business owners can't even talk to their own employees, something's broken.
Yeah.
But that said, we should be able to say that was a common pain point for both the people who were out in the street for George Floyd is, hey, we're constantly crushed by lack of opportunity here and abuse. And then you have the attack on the Capitol, which was largely saying the same thing. We're being abused by our systems, so now we need to go get their attention. And if we're saying the same message, but we're arguing with each other instead of sharing the message to the same people. Isn't something broken about that too? And that's, I think, one of the real things that needs to be solved.
It's ironic that we live in a capitalist society that supposedly is built around the concept of investment and returns, but we don't systematically invest, in the most important asset, which is other human beings. That's left to essentially individual and quasi-community kinds of endeavors. We do not do a good job, investing and capturing those returns.
Come in, yes.
There's our topic for a future conversation.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Because we wouldn't be having. Maybe this is a good place to go out. I had a conversation just before I headed off for my backpacking trip with Victoria. I was at RAI and I was on my motor scooter, and a guy in a Harley Davidson t-shirt came up, and said, "I just want to warn you." Why he picked me, I guess because we were both cyclists. "I just want to warn you that a friend of mine in the Special Forces says they're being prepared for a declaration of martial law." This was just before the inauguration. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, we got into a conversation, and he was clearly pro-Trump. And yet the conversation we ended up having was agreeable, respectful, inquisitive. He ended up asking my opinion about the elections, about the suitcases under the table, about COVID, what we should have done, and so on and so forth. And I gave him my card. He was really interested in what we're doing, with Democracy Counts. And it's like there was almost no light between us in terms of our shared concern.
Yeah, that's so optimistic. That's great.
Yeah, there's an and I'm using that as I think you've heard me say this, Justin. I'm not sure, but I'm using that kind of example. Again, this is just one data point, but I'm using this as a kind of an anecdote to motivate others of us in on the left and the election integrity community and so on, to reach out to people with common interests, irrespective of their policy preferences for carrying out those common interests.
Are we outliers, Dan? Are the two of us outliers in terms of the ability to have a civil conversation about a very hot racial topic? Or do you think it's possible that there are other people like us out there in the public square?
I don't know. This conversation that I listened to, this webinar yesterday. It was a Harvard webinar, and there was the Japanese American congressman. There was a woman from Navajo Nation. There was a young black woman studying the history of slavery. She's a grad student at Harvard, and there was the MC was also black, and it was as if the only people who were accredited with the right to talk about the conversation were people who were who were in the victimized groups.
And that doesn't work. That doesn't work, yeah. Right? That just shuts down.
Well, it doesn't work well. I don't think it necessarily shuts anything down. I don't know what the audience was like. I have no idea because you can't see the audience when it's a closed webinar. But it doesn't work as well as it could. That's why we're having this conversation. So that
the forbidden conversation.
Yeah. So people from all walks of life and all ethnicities and so on and so forth can see that it's really okay to talk with each other.
Yeah. And wouldn't it have been wonderful if at that webinar you were at yesterday, it was the two of us rather than the other speakers? I think the audience would have gained more. What do you think?
Oh, I got something from it because there were people saying important stuff, but it was it was more of a teaching setup than it was an exchange.
Yeah. And teaching is not conversation.
No,
It's not
observing
conversation.
somebody else's conversation, but not really engagement.
That's the
Given
thing.
our
It's the lost
go ahead.
art of discourse, I think. We've
Mhm.
lost the ability. We lost the ability to hear one another and to appreciate one another's difference of opinion.
I've
I
got
think
this book.
I think that's the part of it. Talk to me.
I recommend this book. You can
Mhm.
get it for $1 on Amazon or Abe. Daniel Yankelovich was a very famous pollster, very social science oriented.
Right.
The Magic of Dialogue, Transforming Conflict into Cooperation. It's a powerful, important book, in my opinion. It's, and there's another one called How to Speak and How to Listen by the late president of the University of Chicago, whose name I forget. And I mean, this is about how dialogue, not just talking at each other, but talking with each other. And I mean, you and I are modeling this book, okay, in a way. How to Speak, How to Listen is full of, I mean, it's obviously tips on how to speak, but there is, and we're all taught, how we need to speak. But we're seldom taught how to listen. It's somehow we're supposed to be able to sit here, and the speaker's supposed to land. Whatever the speaker is saying is supposed to land with us. We should not have to do the work. Well, he argues in this book that the listener has some work to do, and this is the yin and yang of dialogue.
Yeah. Yes.
Both have to do the work.
I agree totally. So, a question to you, a little snarky kind of question. Who is threatened? Who is threatened most by this type of conversation you and I have had?
People who don't want to see disturbances in the status quo, generally speaking.
Mhm.
So I'll bring in that Tim and I are a balance to both of you guys.
Yeah.
Because I don't know that we necessarily have the same socioeconomic, well, at least the same economic background, and like there's no Ivy League connection that I could tell of in him. He's very salt of the earth kind of guy, literally salted by fire in some cases. In my family, we lost our farm. They moved from Poland to New York and then that was, Polish people weren't all necessarily welcome there either. So they moved to Canada and then eventually North Dakota, and they still weren't necessarily welcome among the Norwegians. And then so they established their farm. They finally owned their own land, and then they had 2 bad crop years and they lost it all. Literally had to survive on a 100-pound sack of flour that their neighbor gave them for 8 kids and 1 mom. Something like that. And in that sense, and then when my parents came out to California seeking opportunity, well, they ended up living in a small town that didn't have a whole lot of jobs on its own as well. So while I'm fortunate to have gotten the opportunity to go to a highly recognized school in California, my background is really not something that I would say, I have a man of the world education. And so being able to speak from a different upbringing, if you will, probably matters as well in all of this.
Does anyone else want to join on that question?
Oh, can I speak? Can I speak? I don't never know whether I'm being heard or not.
I can hear you.
I think there are more of you than you're thinking at the moment, not tons. It comes in probably tens and maybe, if we're lucky, hundreds at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But there is more and more thinking
that of people who don't know anybody in Harvard, that's its own kind of barrier that I can talk to you about sometime if you want. Although I think it's more up to me to solve it than you guys, but there's more and more thinking in various spiritual communities that we really are all one. And some of that thinking can get just as sloppy and new age woo-woo as you want.
Right, right.
But the thread of the upward movement, I mean, like Joe Dispenza's stuff in eugenic on We Are the Placebo and that sort of thing is all forward thinking. And he's probably I have no idea what his beliefs are about race. I don't think he bothers with it, would be my guess. He's very white, and he's got a whole different thing going on.
Right.
So there's more of it than I hope there's more of it than you're aware of.
Well, that's comforting, Anne. That's good to hear.
Well, shall we?
There's our Jen.
Yeah, let's do this again. Dan, Wink, and I will have a talk where we're thinking about like once a month. So we'll reach back out and see what you guys are feeling, and any feedback post this would be really appreciated too.
Yeah, and feel free to recommend subjects or approaches to subjects or things that you think. If you want to see Wink and I, kind of like.
Right.
The contrast between you guys is great. It's wonderful.
And this will be Wink or Dan will send this out. I'm going to download it. I'll download the full format. So if anyone wants to pull up, I'm also going to download it into the first part into a podcast. So I'll make sure that everyone who is on this call gets all of those links as well.
Do you think that you'll be able to edit the second section into something?
The second section I'm not going to edit. I mean, that's just it's just awesome the way it is, right? I mean, this is what it's supposed to be.
Okay.
I mean,
so you'll post it, say, just alongside or something? Yeah,
that's what I'm going to do. So I'll cut the first part and do it as the podcast with the logos and yada, yada. And the second part, I'm going to just keep it in its entirety. But I'm going to give everyone access to both.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks for that work.
It'll take me a minute because we have been talking for like 3 hours. So
yeah.
But it will be done this week, I promise.
I feel a little talked out because I talked for 3.5 hours.
So not to add any more burden on you right now, but a proposal for a future discussion topic. There are lots of different kinds of oppression. There are lots of kinds of different benevolence. Yeah. But what I want to, I think that we can actually get a common ground on the idea of, does the political system serve all of us? And how can we actually change, not necessarily the tribal identities of like partisan, right? Democrat, Republican, or try to bring in the racial identities or the religious identities, but talk about it from a structural standpoint okay, we have these elections, but obviously the elections themselves didn't resolve the conflict. So what's behind that? What else is driving this conflict? And are there ways that we can change how we vote in order to be more agreeable or more equitable to everybody?
Okay, parliamentarianism. Yeah, it's got some merit.
Well, thank you, Jen. Thank you, Anne and Justin and Zena and Dorothy.
Sure.
Thank you, Dan, and everyone else who was part of this experience. And Dan, we leave friends as we were before we began this morning.
Even better, I would bet.
Thanks. Me too.
Appreciate